into these accounts as a character until nearly the end of chapter 14. So I don't know what you do with that, but there's probably something to be learned there. I've always said if it's weird, it's important. So keep that in mind. I think the timing of God not being present in these two chapters until the very end is to highlight Abram's decisions, that they were based upon what he knew about God and Abraham's growing understanding of God. And we saw him he didn't fall away from God, but he chose to follow his own path going into Egypt, right? So he kind of turned away a little bit, and we'll see in chapter 14 his return to God and trusting in God. So our first thing we're going to look at is Lot looks to get it all. So what do we know about Lot? We know a little bit, but verses 1 through 4 provides the setting for the story, but that setting is a story in itself. It leads us to the understanding of why Lot does what he does and what happens in these next two verses. The story is a story of conflict in the midst of God's blessings. And chapter 13 opens with Abram departing Egypt along with those in his household, with a description of the wealth Adam gained while in Egypt. We see that in verses 1 and 2. Now, we're not going to go ahead and read through all of it because we just don't have time. There's a lot to go through today. But keep your Bibles open to chapters 13 and 14 so that you can reference those. But you'll see in verse 1 and 2, he gained a lot of wealth from Egypt. So I don't know if you remember from a couple weeks ago, Abraham left Egypt with a lot of booty, right? He left Egypt with gold, silver, and livestock. So he left with a lot. And then in verse 3, the account turns to Abram returning to the place between Ai and Bethel where he had built an altar to God. And we know he built that altar in Genesis 12:8. So these few verses stress the return of Abraham to the place where he had been in the beginning. Back in the land, we see Abram renewed his worship and proclamation of the Lord at the altar. So if you remember, he put up this altar, declared basically his allegiance to God, and then he bolts for Egypt, right? Kind of blows it there. But we see at the beginning here, he goes back and reaffirms his allegiance to God. That's what we see in those first few verses. So Abraham's return to this location builds anticipation that Abram will act similarly to his humble, obedient behavior when he first entered the land. So it's a return to his humbleness that he had towards God at the beginning, before he made the choice of going down to Egypt. So if you look at Genesis 13:4, it says, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So with that in mind, what are the characteristics do you guys think of somebody who calls on the name of the Lord?
Total trust in him.
I'm sorry?
Total trust in him.
Trusting him, totally, right? What else? Does it take humility to call on the name? It does. It takes humility to put your plans aside and choose to follow God. So I think humility is another one of those things. So that's what we have in those first 4 verses. Now let's look at Lot. We see a description of Lot, and it's not anything like Adam. We know that he is a nephew of Abram. I mean, it's not anything like Abram. We know that he's a nephew of Abram. And Lot almost seems like an afterthought in this story. And I get that from Genesis 13:5 and 7. I'm already behind. Okay, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Adam's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So it says Lot also went with Abram. So Lot is almost an afterthought here. That's one thing we get from who is Lot. But the repeated description of Lot, as with Adam, strengthens the disassociation. In verse 5, Lot, rather than being part of Abram's household, is now presented in a manner that more closely resembles a fortunate hanger-oner. Right? The fact that Lot also accumulated great possessions in Egypt, was that because of Lot's doing? No, he hung out with Abram. It's because of Abram that Lot acquired a lot of possessions. And this presentation of Lot here in these verses, hanging around Adam, anticipates a conflict or a crisis between the two relatives. And although God promised the land to Abram, the promises had not yet been realized. And Abram and Lot were living in a land possessed by others. And we see that in verse 7. The Canaanites and the Perizzites in the land complicated the care of Abram's and Lot's growing contingent of people and livestock. Now, I was curious about who the Perizzites were, and I couldn't find a whole lot about them. It turns out that they were one of several tribes living in the Promised Land, and they are usually associated with the Canaanites. That's all we know about the Perizzites. The land, we know, could not sustain both men's possessions. So Lot and Abram were in the land, and their herdsmen were arguing amongst each other. Just couldn't do it. So this caused strife between the herdsmen as they jostled for the resources. And keep in mind, the Jebusite or the Perizzites and the Canaanites were already in the land, so you got to figure they might have had the best land as it was to begin with, right? And for the moment, that because the land hadn't been given to Abram, that leaves Lot and Abram fighting for the scraps of the land. So that's really what's going on here. One of the sources I refer to is a Bible Knowledge commentary, and a guy named Alan Ross, a commentator, declared that the Canaanites held the best parts. That's all we know. So given God's promises to Abram concerning the land, how do you guys think Abraham might have responded? So you've got Lot and you got Abram fighting over the land. If it were me and my brother, I know what I would say. What do you think Abram was saying?
What I would say is, I'm in charge, I'm older than you,
Right.
I'm getting the best.
This is my land. It's promised to me. Skedaddle, right? Do we see that Abram, we haven't gotten there yet, but what do you think Abram does?
He humbles himself.
Right. So in a human point of view, you can definitely see Abram standing up and saying, hey, buddy, scram. This is my land. But Abram could have been possessive of the land, and he could have told him to go. If we look at verses 8 through 12, it says, So Abram said to Lot, Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is it not the whole land before you? Oh, is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan. And Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plains, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. So how did Abram's perspective on material gain differ from Lot's?
He wanted the good land.
What's that?
He wanted the good land.
Lot did, right? That would be hard to do, wouldn't it? Because, Abram saw the same thing Lot did. He saw the well-watered land. That would be hard to do.
We have to remember that we just seen Abram rededicate his life to the Lord. So in other words, he trusted. So now you see him humbling himself to his nephew, saying, you pick.
It's a good point.
And he's saying, You pick because God's going to take care of me wherever I go.
And we're going to touch on that a little bit. You kind of get a little gold star for that one. But Abram had the right to choose, and yet he surrendered that right to Lot and accepted Lot's selfish choice without protest or disappointment. So Abram's solution to the strife was selflessly to give Lot the first choice. And the irony, one might expect Abram to cling to what was promised to him and tell Lot to go find his own place. So what do you think Abram knew about the Lord that Lot didn't?
His faithfulness.
Faithfulness. Maybe he had a higher view of God than Lot did. I think in a lot of ways that applies to us as Christians, right? Don't you think as Christians, knowing that God has promised good for us, shouldn't that encourage us to give graciously rather than holding on to what we have? Just like Abraham, there's an example for us to follow. We should give graciously of what we have, whether it's time, money, whatever, knowing that God has promised good to us. So there's a lesson to be learned there. In any case, Abram's behavior toward his nephew Lot was pretty remarkable. Lot had been dependent upon Abram for many years. Keep in mind, all this time he'd been dependent on Abram. Lot received material blessings because of his connection with Abram. And Abram treated Lot as an equal. Abram humbled himself and elevated Lot to keep the peace. In verse 8, we see Abram say, "Let's not have any strife between you and me." And I think as Christians, that would be good for us to remember too. Stay away from strife. Let's not quarrel amongst ourselves. And we shouldn't forget Abram's motivation for keeping the peace. They were relatives. They had a common bond they shared. And Abraham, this was worth saving. So as Christians, isn't our common bond worth saving than throwing away because of selfishness? Okay, so we are ultimately related by blood through Christ, and that is worth saving. So anyhow, the land Lot eyed was compared to both the Garden of Eden and the land of Egypt. And I think it's interesting that the Garden of Eden, while paradise, was also the place where Adam and Eve faced and then gave in to temptation. Think about what happens with Lot. The Nile River in Egypt provided an ample water source and brought fruitfulness to the land. Yet it is where Abram went when he failed to trust God. See the parallel here? Lot is doing exactly what Abram had done in the previous two chapters. Moses, the writer of the book of Genesis, inserted a reference to the yet future destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah for the city's wickedness. That's in 13:10. Moses also plainly stated that the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against God. So Sodom was beautiful, but ripe with temptation. So Lot's choice was both selfish and unwise. Lot was focused on prosperity and indulgence, taking the opportunity to break away from Abram so he could take his life into his own hands. He wanted to become a possessor of many things and much wealth. Do we find ourselves getting caught up in that in our own lives? We do. I come from a family that I'm kind of the black sheep. My family has done really well for themselves. And that's my struggle. I see my family, and it becomes a struggle for me. And whether we realize it or not, I think it becomes a struggle for all of us. We see it throughout the Psalms, the prospering of the wicked. So that's something we need to watch out for. The clause in verse 10, before the land destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, tells us that what appealed to Lot was to be short-lived. Any of you have any idea how long the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was after this event where Lot chose the land? Commentators I found said about 20 to 30 years. So it happened pretty quickly, didn't it? You know, when you think of that, you think hundreds of years. No, it was, and I know Lot is in the story, but you still think, oh, it's not that fast, but it really was. About 20 to 30 years, Sodom would be destroyed. Very short-lived. So without any concern for Abram, Lot made his choice, and it turns out to be the greatest mistake of his life. Lot would pitch his tent where the men were wicked, sinning greatly before the Lord. How well did he pitch his tent? He would even become an alderman, a city alderman. He sat at the gate of the city, and he became one of the leaders of the city of Sodom. And Sodom is a pretty strange place. We'll see in chapter 19 a clarification of their wickedness. We'll get there. But we also see in verse 13, the men of Sodom sinned against God. Does that mean they worship the Lord? No, hardly, right? They sinned against God. And in chapter 9, we're going to see the Lord take some action against Sodom. Or 19, I'm sorry. 19. But for Abram, his actions demonstrated that he understood God was the possessor of all, and therefore he could hold his possessions loosely. And we should remember that as Christians. God possesses all. Don't hold on to your possessions too tightly. Abram knew that God would work out the details of his promise, and Abraham pursued peace above perceived prosperity, and Abram lived by faith, Lot lived by sight. There's some songs made about that, and there's some verses about that. So moving on to our next point, Abram sacrifices to God. That's verses 14 through 18. And I don't know if we have time to read that because we're already running short, I can tell. So, but we know we have Lot temporarily out of the picture. And we see that in these verses 14 to 18. So God entered the scene again in Abram's life to communicate with Abram directly concerning his promises to him. And we see that in verse 18. Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the tabernacle trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar to the Lord there. So God reaffirmed his promise to Abram to give Abram the land. And he directed Abram to look around, even in the direction of Lot's land choice. Because he told him to look in all the directions, right? One of those was the direction that Lot took. It would eventually return to Abram. All Abram saw would one day belong to his descendants, in verse 15. God promised that Abram's descendants would become so numerous that they would be as uncountable as the dust of the earth. We see that in verses 16. Then in verse 17, God directed Abram to walk the length and breadth of the land. Why do you think he did that? It's a cultural thing that not many of us know about. But this walk in the land was not only to give Abram an awareness of the land promised to him, but was also part of Abram's legal acquisition of the land. You see, what was happening culturally back then, or at least cultures contemporaneous to Abram, utilized similar devices to symbolize the receipt of land or kingdoms by walking the land. In fact, new kings and rulers back then were known to circle the walls of their capital cities or to tour the boundaries of their kingdoms as they began their reigns. That was a common thing. So Abram was doing what was common. It was God saying, walk your land. So God could give Abram the land because who owned the land? God did. And to this day, you know, there's a big debate about who Whose land is it? Does Israel belong in the land? Is it their land? We know that that land is the apple of God's eye. And archaeology tells us we don't see any Palestinian artifacts. We don't see any artifacts when they conduct archaeology and diggings on the land. They're all Jewish artifacts, Hebraic artifacts. The land is Abraham's, given to him by God. And we should remember that. So Abram moved his tent to Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. Wow, how in the world did it get to there? I might have messed up my slides. So the highlighted verse on the screen tells us that he moved his tent and dwelt where he did. Why would Abram build an altar to the Lord? Seems to be a common thing, doesn't it? Builds a lot of altars. And we see the Hebrews as they go into the land, into the promised land, the Israelites, they built a lot of altars. Why do you think that is? I'm sorry?
To give thanks.
To give thanks. Absolutely, to give thanks. What? A marker, right? It's a remembrance. Do we sometimes put little verses up on our mirrors and things like that? I haven't done that in a long time, but it's to remember, right? So Abram built an altar to remember. And he sacrifices to God as a means of worshiping God. And as a remembrance that God gave the land to him. So we see that the account of the separation of Lot and Abram ends with Lot wide-eyed with opportunities to profit and indulge himself, and with Abram beginning or building an altar to sacrifice to the Lord. Who of these two really understood who God was? Abram, right? And Abram is the one that acted accordingly. And Abram's string of good decisions in light of who God is continues in our next account. And we're going to look next at the predicament of Lot and his actions. So this is an interesting subject too, and I wish we had more time to look into this. But in your Bibles, you might see, we're moving into chapter 14, you might see the heading above chapter 14 that says Lot's captivity and rescue. Is that what most of you guys see? And that's for sections, verses 1 through 17. Me personally, do you guys watch Lord of the Rings? Have you guys ever seen Return of the King? You know, all that kind of fantasy stuff, that's kind of neat. This isn't fantasy, but it's actual history. But I prefer to give the title, to give that section a more exciting title, The Victory Over the Eastern Kings. Victory over the Eastern Kings, because that's what we're going to see in these verses. Genesis 14, 1 through 16 is a record of the battle of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. And what is interesting here is it is part of the outworking of God's promise to make Abram great and to bless those who blessed him and curse those who curse him. So chapter 14 describes a typical international skirmish. So there's some skirmishes going on here, and it's in the land where Abram lives, the land that was given to Abram. So there's this international skirmish going on in which powerful nations formed a coalition to plunder and subjugate areas near the border of the promised land to Abram. Now Lot, because of his decision to live in Sodom in that area, gets caught up in this skirmish and finds himself captive. So I said that chapter 14 talks about the rebellion of the 5 kings against the subjugation of the 4 kings. So let's look into that account a little bit. In it, we're going to find that Abram rescues Lot, and because of it, Lot loses everything. So once again, God's involvement in the Genesis account here becomes providential and behind the scenes. This intentional omission of referring to God's activities sets the stage for showing Abram's growing understanding of God's possession of all. So keep your Bibles open to verses 1 through 16 of chapter 14. We won't read it for the purposes of time, but allow you to reference that. Okay. So in verses 1 through 4, we see there are 5 kings of the Jordanian plain, and they have been under submission of the 4 eastern kings from Elam and Shinar. Do you guys remember what Elam is from an earlier lesson? What is modern-day Elam? Anybody remember? It's Iran. How about Shinar? Does Shinar ring a bell with anyone? Iraq, Babylon, right? So this is before the days of Babylon and Persia. It was called Elam. So these 4 kings come from that area. And what you're going to see here is those 4 kings, they come from this area here, and they sweep into the land where the kings here have rebelled against their subjugation. So the 4 kings are in red. The 5 kings are in the green. I don't know what the teal is for, but that's the best map I could find. I'm sure it's references somewhere else. But if you can read the writing, you'll see the name of the kings, the 5 kings, in the green. For 13 years, these 5 kings of the Jordanian plains had been put under tribute to these 4 eastern kings. And that included the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And after 13 years, those 5 kings decided, we don't like this anymore and we're going to rebel. So they rebelled. And it triggered a war with the 4 kings of the east, led by King Chedorlaomer of Elam. And they invaded and defeated the people who lived east of the Dead Sea, as well as those as far south as El Paran. Now, this isn't a lesson on strategies, but the book talks about it. So they come down to the land and then they come back up. And it says that's probably because the kings didn't want to be routed or attacked from behind. So they came around and went up and destroyed all the kings in that land. The roundabout path the kings took, the kings of the east took, was probably to ensure that no one would attack them from the rear. The 4 kings of the east were victorious over the 5 kings of the Jordanian plains, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they plundered the cities and took Lot and all his goods with them to Dan, which is north of what is now the Sea of Galilee, about 160 miles from Sodom. We see in verses 8 through 12, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah managed to escape. We see that in that verse right there. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrews, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre. I can't even read that. But anyhow, that's where Abram was. So how might an observer expect Abram to respond to the capture of Lot, considering Lot selfishly chose the well-watered land and then unwisely moved to the wicked city of Sodom? That's the book's question, not mine. But what? So answer that. What would you expect Abram to do?
What goes around comes around.
Wouldn't you think that? That's what I would think. Serves you right. Right? And that's what I would think. Would you risk your livelihood, your life to go save this guy? I probably wouldn't.
Look at the amount of people that Abram had versus those 4 armies.
Well, yeah, we're going to get to that too. It's crazy, isn't it? I wouldn't do it. So the risk for us in our material sense would be too great, right? To rescue someone who acted so selfishly and unwisely. But after the hearing about his nephew's capture, what did Abram do? He quickly took up arms. Now, here's the amazing thing about Abram. So when you think of Abram, what do you think of? For me personally, I've always kind of remembered the Sunday school pictures of Abram. You know, kind of an older guy with a staff, you know, wearing a coat, you know, a big robe with a long beard. Is that kind of how you guys picture Abram? I do. But he had 318 trained servants. They were warriors, trained warriors. What kind of guy has 318 trained warriors? That wasn't all of his servants. He took 318 trained servants and he pursued the enemy as far as Dan. See that in verse 14. Abram defeated the invaders in a night attack. And those of you that don't know, Dan was the future northern border of the Promised Land. So he pursued them 140 miles. No cars, no tanks, no planes or helicopters. Can you imagine walking 140 miles to pursue these guys? You've already rescued your nephew, right? Abram was going to take it to him, teach him a lesson. And then Abram would pursue them an additional 100 miles to Hobra. That's a pursuit of 240 miles on foot. Now, for me, I don't know if I'd pursue somebody 10 miles on foot, much less 240 miles, right? If they're willing to run away from me 10 miles, let them be. He went 240 miles. Another thing to add to that is his army was probably dwarfed by the army of the four kings. Keep in mind, this army of four kings had just defeated and destroyed and plundered a region of 5 kings that had their own armies. Now, we don't know much about Abram's trained servants. If they were newbies in combat, they probably were, but these were battle-hardened troops. And Abram pursued them and defeated them. That's pretty amazing to me. His men successfully defeated the kings of the east, pursuing them north beyond Damascus. Abram freed Lot and recovered his good, as well as all the goods belonging to the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. So he even recovered the goods of those kings and gave them back to him, not just of Lot. So this was a huge victory for the patriarch Abram over 4 leading kings who had just previously conquered such an extensive portion of Transjordania and the area of the Dead Sea. So what did I ask you before? What do you think of Abram? Kind of what I always pictured Abram to be, right? Kind of a wise guy, staff and a beard. I think we should probably reconsider what we think about Abram. How's this? Maybe a little bit too far-fetched. I mean, it's crazy. He just defeated that army with his men. Maybe cut the beard a little bit. I think our Sunday school images of Abram are not necessarily what we think they were, maybe later in life. Do you guys remember that movie, Princess Bride? Where Diego Montoya is going to fight that guy, and the guy says something, and Diego Montoya says, I don't think that means what you think it means. I don't remember the exact verbiage. Just entered my mind. I wished I had put it in here. But I don't think what we think of Abraham is what we really thought it was. So, what do you think Lot said to Abram when Abram showed up to set him free? What do you guys think Lot said? What's that? Given how selfish he is, right? I can see that. Do you think Lot learned any lessons from this? You think he learned some lessons? He should learn some. He should have learned some lessons. What actually happened? He probably didn't learn any lessons. Because what did Lot do? He went right back to Sodom and Gomorrah, or to Sodom. So he went back to live in that city, and he became even more entrenched in that vile city. And we're going to see another rescue of Lot in chapter 19. And who initiates that rescue of Lot?
God does.
What's that?
God does.
God rescues Lot, but at whose insistence?
Oh, wow.
Abram. Abram kind of rescues Lot again twice. He's going to do it. And Lot never learns his lesson. Okay, so moving on. It's probably worth noting that the king of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't lift a finger to help Lot. They fled the battle and decided to stay home while Abram embarked on a dangerous 240-mile rescue mission. And one would think that would cause Lot to realize the lack of loyalty the king of Sodom and Gomorrah had towards him. And it would give him a deep affection for Abram. And we just don't see that it did. So look at Genesis 14:13 again. In case you miss it, this is the first place that Abram is called a Hebrew. We never see that happen before. This is the first occurrence in the Bible. Abram's military activity in this chapter shows that this is a meaningful designation. He was a true force to be reckoned with among the nations. So, Abram is now a clan. He's recognized among the nations. At least that's what the commentator said, and it makes sense. Okay, moving on to Abram recognizes God as a possessor of all. He rescues Lot. God recognizes Abram as a possessor of all. We don't have a lot of time, but we're going to read this passage because I think it's important. It says, Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who had delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from the thread of a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of men who went with me, Abner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. So Abram was the general here and had the great victory. It was attributed to him, but he does not fully explain the triumph. We know that from verse 17. We don't know. The triumph isn't completely explained. But as Abram returned from defeating the kings of the east, he was met by the kings of Sodom and this mysterious king of Salem, Melchizedek. So does Salem sound familiar to you? I mean, Jerusalem. So commentators were saying that there were a couple Salems in the Bible, but this one most likely refers to the area of Jerusalem before David made it his capital. So Melchizedek was in Jerusalem, Salem at the time. In fact, they go on to say that it was even likely that Melchizedek was king of Jerusalem at the time. So perhaps the name Jerusalem was shortened to emphasize the idea of peace, because shalom transliterated is Salem. So Melchizedek greeted Abram with a meal. Melchizedek is described as a priest of God Most High, and this is the first reference to priests in the Bible. Before this, we don't have any reference to priests. Priests don't come later until the tribe of Levi, and they're established as priests. So this is the first reference to priests. As we continue looking at the passage, Abram's actions demonstrated that he understood Melchizedek to be a legitimate representative of God. The giving of tithes to Melchizedek was a way for Abram to give to God, or give God credit for God's providential work in securing victory. So rather than taking credit for himself, Abram gave credit to God as the possessor of all. And it was right for him to do that, right? How about in our own lives? Does God deserve the credit for everything that we have? No matter how small, no matter how hard we think we worked for something. It all comes from God. And we'd be good to remember that. So why do you think the king of Sodom made a generous offer to Abram?
Because he got all his possessions back.
He got all of his possessions back. The commentators in the story, now I don't know if I necessarily agree with this, but some of the commentators indicated that the reason they gave such a generous offer to Abram is because they were embarrassed by Abram's courageous willingness to pursue the fight with the kings of the east, and they bailed. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I think the point is we need to recognize that what Abram did was pretty spectacular. So these king of Sodom made Abraham a generous offer that would have made Abram quite wealthy. The king's offer was in the form of a command, but it showed the weakness of the king's position. A strong king might have demanded that all the goods be returned to him along with the people. But the king of Sodom said, you can have all the goods, I just want the people. King of Sodom recognized his defeat and his failure to fight. So Abram refused to take the goods from the king of Sodom. Abram wanted to avoid a dubious connection with the city. While denying his own rights, Abram did not force the men to make his same decisions. He allowed them to take their spoils. So in those times when you defeated a people or a city or a kingdom, you were able to take spoil. Abram refused the spoil. But of those men that he had under his command, he let them take some spoil. But Abram refused it. So we don't get into much detail about Melchizedek, and the lesson doesn't cover it. In fact, I've already covered more than the lesson covers. But just really briefly, what do we know about Melchizedek? What do you guys think you know about Melchizedek, or have you spent much time looking at him? He's really an interesting character, and it's very strange.
Well, he's a type of Christ.
He is a type of Christ. So, Melchizedek in the Bible is the only person whom Abram recognized as his spiritual superior. I don't know if you guys know that. He was the king of Salem, Jerusalem, and he was a priest of the Most High God. We know that because he received tithes from Abram.
Another thing I just realized, just noticed it now, that he brought out wine, bread and wine.
Yes.
That's a very interesting significance because when Christ died and was resurrected, what do we give him?
Right. The Passover supper, broke bread. Pastor mentioned that this morning, and wine. We don't see that anywhere else. Bread and wine. Do you know Melchizedek has no record or recorded birth or death? And you can find it throughout the Bible. It's Hebrews 5:7, Isaiah 32:17, Colossians 1:20, Romans 3, Psalms 1:10. Right. We have some speculations about him. So some of the speculations are that Melchizedek must have been Shem. You know, a great, or great-great-grandfather, something like that. I don't remember the genealogy. But to those who claim that, we know that can't be. Hebrews 7:3 says, no mother, no father, neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, and remains a priest continually. That's what it says of Melchizedek. No father, no mother, no end of life. But he was made like the Son of God, and he remains a priest continually. Was Melchizedek Christ? Some say it was Christ, a Christophany of Christ. We know that can't be, because Christ's priesthood was made after the order of Melchizedek. So Christ is a similitude of Melchizedek. We see that in Hebrews 7:3 and 15. So if he wasn't Christ, if he wasn't a man, he has no beginning or end, was he a celestial being? What do you guys think? Melchizedek is very puzzling because the Bible tells us no, he was a man. He was a man without beginning or end, so he couldn't have been a celestial being. Hebrews 7:4 tells us that. All we know about Melchizedek is that he was a type of Christ. That's all we'll know, and maybe that's all we'll ever know until we reach the other side of eternity. We know he was a type of Christ. It's emphasized in Hebrews 7:4. Jesus is also a king of righteousness and peace. Romans 3 and 5, 4:17, Isaiah 32:17. We know that Melchizedek is called a king and a priest. Who else is called a king and a priest? I've mentioned this before. Christ is a king and a priest. Who else? Us. We are kings and priests. Melchizedek is pretty confusing, strange character, but Christ is a similitude of him. Christ is a priest and king, and so are we. So that's something interesting to think about as you move on. There's a whole lot more we could talk about it, and it probably warrants its own lesson, but we don't have time for that. But studying it would probably be beneficial, and you'll probably be rewarded from that. So what do we want to learn from this lesson? We're out of time, but we'll try to go quick. Remember that the account of the separation of Lot and Abram concludes with Lot chasing opportunities to gain wealth for himself, and with Abram sacrificing to the Lord. Abram's and Lot's worldviews then played out in the account of the invading kings. While Lot was seeking gain, he lost everything, including his freedom. Abram came to his aid and again recognized God as a possessor of all. And he passed on another opportunity to realize substantial financial gain. Sacrificing and giving characterized Abram as he tithed to God and returned goods to Lot and the king of Sodom. He could have rightfully claimed all of that, and yet he returned it all. He recognized God as the creator and possessor of all things. Abraham recognized he is infinitely worthy of his affection and attention. What do you guys think? Should we recognize in our daily lives just what Adam recognized? We're not fighting the battle of 5 kings, but we are fighting spiritual battles in our lives today. And I am probably one of the chief guys that will forget how God has blessed my life. Maybe it would do us all well to remember the blessings God has given us. So if we are spending our lives wide-eyed and chasing, wanting, craving, and wishing, then we should take some time to know God better, right? And I think that's how we'll find our affections and attentions brought back to God. And that's how we get to know God better, is by spending time in the Word. That's all I have for you guys. Anybody have any questions? There's a lot more going on about that battle of 5 kings. We didn't get to talk about it, but if you look at the names of the kings and the people groups, you see a lot of ites in there. Now, if you know much about the ites and Genesis 6, a lot of them were giants. There's a good possibility that Abraham fought literal giants in those battles and still won, or Abram. A lot of interesting stuff about that battle, too. So if you got some time to look at that, that would be a fun one, too. Any questions? Okay, let's close in prayer. Dave, would you mind closing us in prayer?
Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. Lord, we thank you for your message and the example of Abraham, and also a lot, Lord, and caution and things we see in the lives there, Lord, that we can take to heart and evaluate our own hearts and motives. And Lord, we just thank you for your preservation of your people and for the work that you continue to do. Please. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, David.